I'm glad to be here. It feels like I'm in the theatre. We've not only got the stalls, but we've got the circle as well, which is nice. Always glad to be in Tbilisi and to get a good audience. So I'm going to talk today about Abkhazia and South Ossetia and international context of those conflicts. I'm going to talk a bit at the end about the European Union and offer a few modest ideas about looking forward. I can answer questions about other subjects as well, but that's going to be the subject of my lecture. I've called it the long view because I think this is a long-term conflict and we should be looking a bit further into the future if we want to find any solutions to it. Long view also reflects my personal history as someone who's been coming now to this region now. It shows my age for 3 decades, and I actually first went to Abkhazia, believe it or not, in 1992, 3 months before the war began. So I have quite a long perspective on this conflict, and quite a sad perspective because I caught Abkhazia when it was still a place at peace. But I'm going to start far away. I'm going to start far away from Abkhazia and South Ossetia, both in time and place, to see if we can, by going far away in time and place, we can have a little critical distance on the subject. I'm going to start with Lord Palmerston, who was the most famous British foreign secretary, foreign minister of the 19th century. And Lord Palmerston is famous for 2 quotations. The first quotation makes him the father of the modern school of what we call foreign policy realism, which was most famously taken up by Henry Kissinger in its modern exposition. And Palmerston famously said, "We," meaning Britain, "we have no eternal allies and we have no perpetual enemies. Our interests are eternal and perpetual, and those interests it is our duty to follow." So that's a famous realist quotation from Palmerston. Second quotation dates to 1865, and it relates to what's now an obscure conflict about a province called Schleswig-Holstein, which is in the north area in the north, what's now in the north of Germany, bordering Denmark. And there was a conflict over Schleswig-Holstein, in fact 2 conflicts over Schleswig-Holstein. And Lord Palmerston said, "The Schleswig-Holstein question is so complicated, only 3 men in Europe have ever understood it. One was Prince Albert, who is dead. The second was a German professor who became mad. I am the third, and I've forgotten all about it." The Schleswig-Holstein question was, as I said, was 2 real conflicts, and of course it's kind of a joke, but these were 2 real conflicts in which thousands of people died. 2 wars fought in 1848 to 51 and in 1864 between Denmark and German powers, very traumatic in particular for Denmark. It ended in basically the German powers taking control of these regions and all their Danish citizens. A very complicated issue, as Palmerston said, so I'm not going to say I understood it, but this had been regions which had been associated with Denmark for centuries but not fully part of it, but they had a large German population who wanted to be part of the German Confederation. There were constitutional issues about who should be the ruler. There was a disputed treaty of 1460 that everyone interpreted differently. So this was basically a disputed province that at the time of national consolidation, when Denmark and Germany were becoming 2 nation states, resulted in a conflict. Does that sound a bit familiar? Well, maybe it does sound a bit familiar. What lessons can we learn from this famous quotation from Lord Palmerston? Well, the conflicts change, that a conflict which is very intense and traumatic for one generation, a generation later it becomes ignored, becomes almost forgotten. The reason that a conflict is started becomes forgotten. What is remembered is the trauma people suffered during that conflict. And in the case of Denmark, this apparently was a very traumatic story in the history of modern Denmark. People were displaced. and if you read some of the literature on it, Denmark decided not to get involved in any foreign military operations for more than a century after the Schleswig-Holstein conflict. Not until 1999 did Denmark send troops abroad when it committed them to the NATO operation in Yugoslavia. On a slightly more positive note, I guess we should say that conflicts become non-violent, and then people get over them. A new generation begins to forget, and of course the idea that Germany and Denmark would fight a bloody conflict today is obviously a non-starter. It's quite absurd. There's also an international aspect to this example. Conflicts have a certain international currency. Lord Palmerston was talking about a conflict which had slipped down the international agenda, and a conflict which was only of interest to Britain for Britain's own narrow interests. When he was talking about interests, the interests of the great powers in this conflict were, and this was not only Britain but also France and Russia, they didn't want to see a weakened Denmark losing territory to a big new German power, and they didn't want to see Denmark losing an important naval base of Kiel, which controlled the entrance to the Baltic Sea. So Britain and Russia suddenly took the same position on the conflict, even though 10 years before in Crimea they'd been fighting one another. So again, we get back to the issue that great powers, when it comes to conflicts, they don't have friends and enemies, they have interests. Okay, so we started a long way away, but this talking about this obscure 19th century conflict, I guess, is a way for me to try and frame a longer perspective on the Abkhazia and South Ossetia conflicts. Those conflicts still mean a great deal here in Tbilisi. They mean obviously a lot to the people in Abkhazia and South Ossetia. They have meaning for people like me who have studied them over the years. But let's not fool ourselves. For the world in general, Abkhazia and South Ossetia are about as obscure as Schleswig-Holstein. Ask the average person on the street across the world, and they are equally obscure names. And of course, these conflicts are now also getting relatively old. The first conflicts, the first violence in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, the first violence in these conflicts happened 30 years ago. In the case of Abkhazia, it happened in 1989, and we're talking about conflicts which the passing of time has made incredibly intractable. Wars in the 1990s, and then the wars and then the war of 2008, which has basically made access to certainly to Ossetia and also to South Ossetia, to Abkhazia, much more difficult. These are also, let's be clear now, the passing of time adds new dimensions, new complications to conflicts. They become multi-dimensional. 2008 certainly made this much more of a Russia-Georgia conflict on top of the existing Georgia-Abkhazia, Georgia-South Ossetia conflicts, and of course added also even an extra dimension about Russia and the West both having their clients, as it were, in this region. But let's go back a bit and see that, of course, these did not start as international conflicts. The initial violence was over really something quite simple. Who recalls, I'm sure some of you do, but many of you probably do not, what was the first instance of violence in Abkhazia in 1989? Well, it was over what today would seem to be a relatively much smaller issue. It was about the demand of Georgian students at the Abkhaz State University to convert the Georgian sector of that university into a branch of Tbilisi State University. It's about It was about a kind of status of one sector of the Abkhaz university, but that was such a toxic issue in 1989 that it led to riots. It led to at least 18 deaths and hundreds of people being injured. And of course, once the violence is a kind of Rubicon, it's a red line. Once a line is crossed, then the conflict becomes not just about the causes of the conflict, it becomes about the dead, the injured, it's about solidarity, it's about self-defense. Conflict becomes about the conflict itself. Then in 1991, 1992, the conflict starts to become international, and this is when we're talking about the international perspectives of the conflict. And I'm going to talk about four different actors in this conflict and try and examine their sort of changing perspectives. The first is Tbilisi, I think it's interesting to note that in 1992, in June, the South Ossetia conflict, a ceasefire agreement was signed in June, but in August the conflict in Abkhazia started. There was just a few weeks, literally a few weeks, in 1992 when Georgia was at peace. And in the middle of that period, Georgia managed to join the United Nations. So in a strange way, the South Ossetia conflict was not international, but the Abkhazia conflict, Georgia had already joined the United Nations just literally 2 weeks before. In fact, some people even argue on the Abkhaz or Russian side that this was a stimulus to the Georgian side to launch an operation, is that they'd got UN membership and therefore they could be bolder in Abkhazia. Since then, I think Georgia has always tried to internationalize the Abkhazia issue, with varying success. Tried to kind of make this an issue for the international community. It's an understandable tactic, but the success has been varied. And certainly in the 1990s, I think one of my Georgian interlocutors has aptly said that the West was intellectually absent from this conflict. And there were several initiatives, indeed, put forward which did not receive approval in the West, which would have made things easier. My former colleague in Washington, Ambassador James Collins, negotiated with the Russians and the Georgians for a blue-helmeted UN peacekeeping force in Abkhazia in the mid-90s. He talks about this, but this is a little-known fact. And basically, he got agreement from Yevgeny Primakov, Russian foreign minister, for this force, but he couldn't get agreement in Washington. So when we talk about an international element to this conflict, it was the problem in the mid-90s. It was actually lack of interest in Washington, even though there was approval, sadly, in Moscow. I think Georgia has always had competing and, I would say, even contradictory strategies towards Abkhazia. There's been one strategy which is to kind of use international pressure, economic blockade and so on to make the Abkhaz surrender and to punish Russia also. And then there's been a kind of positive outreach to offer the Abkhaz the benefits of being in Georgia. Of course, there's a kind of contradiction here. With one hand, you're basically saying that the Abkhaz are your enemies who deserve to be punished. On the other hand, you're saying that they are citizens of Georgia who deserve to be welcomed back. And of course, these mixed messages were always treated with, meant that the Georgian overtures were always treated with a bit of suspicion in Abkhazia itself. In the 2000s, it was a time of greater dynamism, where I think these mixed messages became stronger. Certainly in the Saakashvili era, you could almost have two parallel policies from Tbilisi. You had Irakli Alasanya, who I sort of bumped into a few hours ago, incidentally, in Tbilisi. I didn't know he was here. Irakli Alessania, with a peace initiative, negotiating very seriously with the Abkhaz side, and then you had some quite strong bellicose rhetoric from other members of the Saakashvili government, and simultaneously a military build-up on the Georgian side. So again, you had these mixed messages, of course, the military build-up was in response to a Russian military build-up, and you know, contributed to the war of 2008 in South Ossetia. Since 2012, certainly we have seen much more the second message, the message of outreach, positive outreach to Abkhazia and also to South Ossetia being employed by the Georgian government, combined with, you know, an emphasis on securing recognition of Georgia's territorial integrity, Georgia's position at the United Nations, again in response to the Russian strategy of trying to get these two territories recognized. This is, you know, it's a rational policy, it's an understandable policy, but I think, you know, many people would agree that it's not in itself sufficient. There's a risk that it becomes a substitute for a policy. A rhetorical question, you know, if in the year 2039 the United Nations General Assembly is passing another resolution reaffirming the territorial integrity of Georgia and the right of return of refugees, is that a success or a failure that they're still passing? If in 20 years' time the UN General Assembly is to pass such a resolution, you know, more clearly is needed, and we see that in the other aspect of the policy in the recent last year's initiative, A Step for a Better Future, outreach by the Georgian government to Abkhazia and to South Ossetia. Again, many good ideas in that policy. I approve of that policy personally and welcome it. But as many people, rather with some sort of black humor, both in Abkhazia and here in Tbilisi, say the Georgian government often comes up with the right policy, but many years too late. I think this was a good policy for a few years ago, but unfortunately it doesn't have traction, it doesn't have much reception on the other side. When we look at the changing perspectives of the Abkhaz side, I think they've always been dreamers. They've always had quite unrealistic ambitions about what is possible for a small people in a small territory on the Black Sea, but pursued those unrealistic goals with great determination. You know, using allies as they come, and some of those allies, you know, came with a price tag. The Russians who helped them in particular. But only in 1999, it's important to say, did they finally declare independence. Up until that point, there were still negotiations about some kind of autonomous arrangement with Georgia. So I think we have to remember that there have been different Abkhaz policies as well. And another different Abkhaz policy was in the mid-2000s, when Sergei Bagapsh was leader of Abkhazia. There was an attempt at a European opening. It was called Key to a Better Future. It was quite a naive policy, I would say, but it talked about how Abkhazia wanted independence within the European context. But it certainly reflects a certain reality in Abkhazia at the time that we shouldn't forget, that the Abkhaz elite didn't just see its future with Russia, but they wanted some relations with Europe as well. So we should not forget that there was that reality in the mid-2000s, and that constituency, that pro-European constituency, is still there in Abkhazia. And we also shouldn't forget that people talk in the late Soviet era, people talk about Sukhumi as a very cosmopolitan place, with a very cosmopolitan culture and a very kind of European perspective. Obviously, that all changed in 2008. Suddenly there was Russian recognition, massive Russian material investment. That completely changed the picture. But you have this paradox that recognition by Russia came accompanied by international isolation, and you know, the recognitions, I would argue, of places like Venezuela, Syria, etc., have probably made have really meant very little in practice and have made Abkhazia more internationally isolated, even though they are nominally 2 votes at the United Nations. So Abkhazia, I think, is in this real dilemma that it knows that it needs development. It needs, as a when I was last there, I could see that materially it was better off, but still huge lagging behind in the health sector, education sector. It needs a development strategy, something that Russia is not really providing. Russia is just providing some cash and some infrastructure, but no investment in human capital. But it also knows that to engage with Europe is also politically very difficult and involves some kind of interaction with Europe. So I think the Abkhaz elite understands this dilemma, but hasn't found a way of dealing with it. And one reason that they haven't dealt with it is my third actor of the 4, which is Russia. Russia, I think, you know, we know that Russia is a large, strong, often country which uses military force, that it's the bear which throws its weight around, and so on. But I think we shouldn't. That is all true, but there is a but, and the but is that Russia also has different policies. Russia changes. I don't think we should. It's not possible to say that we can see an unchanging Russian policy for the last 200 years. There have been very different Russian policies towards this region, towards Georgia and Abkhazia. You know, if we just look at the 19th century, we can see that it was Georgians who were the partners of Russia, and Abkhaz were perceived as the problem. The Georgians were the fellow Orthodox nation who were the partners in the struggle against the Muslim mountain peoples of the North Caucasus, including the Abkhaz, and you know, they were deported. The Circassians and the Abkhaz and others were deported to the Ottoman Empire in the 1860s. The Abkhaz had their rights restricted, while the Georgians were given many more privileges. So that there was a different dynamic then. You could say it was still imperial politics, but it was imperial politics with a different agenda. And in the Soviet era, of course, very different, many different eras in this, very different. It's almost impossible to list them, from the 1920s, which was an era of kind of Bolshevik workers' solidarity, the 1930s, mass repression, and then, you know, the post-war period when it was a much more benign atmosphere. But certainly many different policies from Moscow, and that, I think, and although when we look at the war of 1992, 1993, we see a Russian military involvement on the Abkhaz side. But it's also important to say this was not the position of the whole Russian elite. I don't think it was the position of Boris Yeltsin, if you noticed Georgia, who was seeking better relations with Georgia. There were still multiple policies. It was, I think, not until the 2000s that we saw a more consolidated policy on Abkhazia. Certainly in the 1990s, there was a CIS, Commonwealth of Independent States, blockade against Abkhazia, which Russia helped support. So that Russia was actually squeezing Abkhazia as well in the 1990s. So again, there's a contradictions in Russian policy. What is Abkhazia? Is Abkhazia a partner and a bridge towards the South Caucasus, or is it a pawn somewhere to a military base to intimidate Georgia? And I don't think there is a single coordinated understanding in Russia of the strategic importance of Abkhazia, which makes things difficult, but it also means that there is still some possibility of change in the future. Maybe not when Putin is president, but maybe at a later period. Let me just talk a little bit about the European Union, and I do want to leave some time for questions. European Union, obviously the latest arrival on the scene of these actors, really was until the 2000s, was basically, I think, an economic development actor in this region, and only in the, I think, mid-2000s became more of a political actor, and obviously since 2008 has been I think, the major political actor in this region, including in the Abkhazia conflict. There's the and the European Union in 2009 adopted, when Peter Semneby was the special representative, adopted the non-recognition and engagement policy. And it's important to say this is still the framework for EU policy towards Abkhazia and South Ossetia. It's sometimes forgotten. Nothing was ever published, but this is still the formally adopted policy of the European Union. And in my new report, unfortunately, I've run out of copies, but you can read it online. I discuss this in much more detail. I think it's important to say that there were many, and talking to Semneby and seeing the one paper which was published about this policy, there were many ambitious ideas. There was an idea for intense economic cooperation with Abkhazia, even to advocating reopening the railway. There was ideas of heavy investment in education. Certainly there was an idea for an EU information center in Sukhumi. I'm told that this project was basically approved in Brussels, in Sukhumi, and Tbilisi, and then at the last minute there was some problems in Georgia about how this information center should be named. But I think that project, was very near completion in 2006, 2007. What has prevented greater EU involvement, engagement in Abkhazia? Many things. There was obviously the 2008 war and Russia's suddenly much greater dominance in the region. The EU's own lack of visibility, I think, has been a problem. Certainly, some resistance on the Abkhaz side has also been a problem, and resistance by Russia. But also, we have to say, Tbilisi has also constrained greater EU engagement in Abkhazia, because not long after the non-recognition and engagement policy, we saw their own Georgian strategy, which included the law and occupied territories, and the Georgian strategy, which foresaw a much more narrower engagement with Abkhazia, that everything should be all international activity should be explicitly approved by Tbilisi. There should be very restrictions on economic activity. And this has also very much restricted international engagement in Abkhazia. And I think, to my mind, this has really been a mistake. The last decade has seen the closing down of space in Abkhazia, and I don't think Tbilisi has benefited from that. And the conflict has also fallen down the agenda, and this is not surprising. Again, get back to my obscure 19th century conflict. People move on when they don't see progress. They put their time and their resources and their money elsewhere. These conflicts are not really on the agenda so much. Last year in the European Parliament, Federica Mogherini, the European kind of de facto foreign minister, special representative, gave a speech to the European Parliament last year, and she said on these conflicts, all of our actions within the two regions are fully coordinated, and I would like to understand this because it is a very important point, and approved by the government of Georgia, and fully in line with the Georgian engagement policy. This, of course, reflects the kind of strong bilateral agenda with Georgia, that Brussels and Tbilisi have a closer relationship than ever before. And this speech was very much welcomed in Georgia, that we fully support Georgian policy. But to be honest, I read this with a little skepticism, because I think it's fine to coordinate, but the EU has its own intrinsic interests in these conflicts. And just to say that we fully approve of the Georgian policy is almost to say that we don't have our own policy, and therefore that we're basically not proposing anything new, and that can be quite risky. So I think I hope I misread that I read it wrongly, but I think there's a warning sign in that speech that the EU is no longer so actively interested in having its own policy towards these conflicts. Let me just finish by saying, looking a bit towards the future, I'm very glad to answer questions. I'm aware that I'm leaving many questions unanswered in this small lecture, but I think it's true to say that all regional actors really have their hands tied when it comes to conflicts. Their room for maneuver is quite small, whether it be in Tbilisi, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and even Russia, which I think has committed itself to a policy of recognition, which I think many people in Moscow probably think is a mistake, but it's certainly not going to reverse that policy. So of all the actors that I've mentioned, I think the European Union is the one which still has the greatest room for maneuver. If we look at the European Neighbourhood Review of 2015, explicitly it's written there that protracted conflicts continue to hamper development in the region. So that there's still an acknowledgement in Brussels that this is a very unsatisfactory situation. We've got these two unrecognized regions. We've got Russian military forces there without host country consent. We have a security problem, and we also have a problem of these societies which are in this state of limbo. So, but the EU still has some room for maneuver, and to return to the thought of that these conflicts started 30 years ago as quite small issues. I don't think it's not possible anymore to make these conflicts smaller. They've become multi-dimensional. But let me sort of give you another quotation, which I always like very much about problem solving. It comes from Dwight Eisenhower, the US president. He's credited with saying, whenever I run into a problem I can't solve, I always make it bigger. I can never solve it by trying to make it smaller, but if I make it big enough, I can begin to see the outlines of a solution. He's not saying make it worse, he's just saying expand the kind of parameters of the problem, sort of try and view it in a wider perspective. And I think that's a useful way to look at these conflicts, that there are long-term conflicts which are probably with us for at least another decade, if not two, that they involve a number of regional actors, and so that it needs a bigger strategy, a longer perspective to find us some solutions. And the argument I make in this report is that this, given that there is no immediate conflict resolution in sight, and the Georgian government is limited what it can do in Abkhazia, it should really be about keeping some space open, about interacting with the society in Abkhazia, and trying to allowing the EU and other international actors go where the Georgian government cannot go, and doing things there which have a development agenda which helps society within a framework of non-recognition, which are helping ordinary people. Things like the EU Information Centre, things like assisting the university, environmental projects. I think all of these things would have benefits for a society, and hopefully help create a society which is more outward-looking, more friendly to international cooperation, and in the future could also be friendlier towards Georgia. Let me just give one example from my report. When in the 1990s, northern Cyprus was also a very closed society. It had very strong, close links with Turkey. Borders were closed. It was very inward-looking. They had proclaimed independence, and yet things began to change. It began to open up more to the world. In 2003, the Green Line opened between the two sides of Cyprus. Now there are international tourists in Cyprus. There are even international flights. There are students there. And this did not strengthen the project for independence of Northern Cyprus. It actually weakened it. Turkish Cypriot society has become more pro-European, more inclined to dialogue with the South. It's a very different conflict, but I think it's a sign that, and there are that the fears here that greater engagement will somehow strengthen separatism in Abkhazia need to be reviewed. I think that's not necessarily the case, and I think there's a strong argument that having a more pro-European, less Russified society on the other side is of benefit to Georgia. Now, if there is this kind of engagement, it shouldn't be done unconditionally. There needs to be a give and a take. Assistance needs to also come with demands, I think, to work with the Abkhaz and demand things from them. You're offering them more assistance, but you're also making demands with them, whether it be on issues such as the rights of the Gali Georgians or detainees. It should be looking at what you're offering more, but you're also asking more from the other side. And again, this should be done definitely in coordination with the Georgian government, such an initiative, but clearly it's not going to happen wrapped in a Georgian flag. It's going to happen wrapped in the flag of the EU and other international partners. Will this happen? Well, there's not much signs of it at the moment. I think both sides need to demonstrate some willingness that they're interested in this kind of greater international engagement in Abkhazia. The opening is still there, but the opening, I'm afraid, is closing, and year by year it becomes more difficult to talk about an international perspective for Abkhazia. My fear is that if this opening is not taken, then Abkhazia will become more and more like South Ossetia and more closed. And also, the world has other issues to deal with and will move on and will not devote time and resources to this conflict if the parties do not show greater interest in international involvement. The fear is that in 5-10 years' time, this could become an even more forgotten conflict, and even more akin to the forgotten conflict that I began with in the 19th century in Schleswig-Holstein, but unfortunately not in a nice northern part of Europe, but in a much more sensitive part of Europe in the Caucasus. So there's a few final thoughts about how it's important to keep interest in this conflict alive, but to do that, there needs to be a certain political will to show more creativity, more openings. Otherwise, unfortunately, the world moves on, and conflicts like this become more forgotten and more intractable. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much, and I'll be glad to have a question and answer session. Thank you.